Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. Today's case is a tragic example of an older woman who was struggling to make ends meet and decided to supplement her income by renting out rooms in her home with catastrophic results. Anita Cowen was an independent woman who had always wanted to own her own home after years spent renting. She married and divorced at a fairly young age and had a son named Stephen, who she was very close to. In the early 2000s, she had her own business recruiting nurses to hospitals, and in 2002, at the age of 52, she finally achieved her dream of home ownership. After visiting Palm Springs, at the suggestion of a friend, she fell in love with the place and purchased a 3-bedroom house in a cul-de-sac called Heritage Court in Cathedral City, located just east of Palm Springs in the Coachella Valley. The area was a fairly quiet, relatively safe, working-class desert city. Her son and daughter-in-law, Stephen and Cindy Sturt, lived approximately 3 hours away in San Diego, but the three maintained a close relationship and regularly spoke on the telephone. When Anita was in her early 60s, she had to close her business and then had to find an alternative way to make money and pay her bills. She took a part-time job at Walgreens Pharmacy, but this did not pay enough to make ends meet. She took out a loan against the equity in her car to pay her bills, but this was only a short-term fix. Living in the desert meant that her utility costs were extremely high, and it is not uncommon for people to rent out their spare rooms in order to supplement their income. Anita loved her house and needed to find a way to keep it, so she decided to put an advertisement on Craigslist to attract tenants for her 2 spare rooms. The advertisement provided the details of the house: quiet residential cul-de-sac private home, amenities pool and spa, private backyard / private entrance, upscale fully furnished private bedroom, cable TV, high-speed internet, available use of a 2-car garage, and then went on to add that she would prefer single gal / guy, suitable for student, executive, and then concluded with the price per month. That income would need to be verifiable with background and credit checks completed. In reality, this didn't happen. When people inquired about the rooms, provided they had the rent and deposit, she would let them move in without completing any further checks. Her son, Stephen, would ask her to screen the potential tenants before they came to live with her, but she never did, mainly due to the costs involved with completing background checks. This worked to a point, and Anita had a series of tenants, some of which were fine, but others caused her problems. With the many tenants coming and going, the police were often called to incidents at her home. Some tenants would come in and then refuse to pay rent or eat all of her food. On multiple occasions, Anita would call the police to help her remove tenants, and the officers would need to explain the legal process on how she could evict these people from her home. One of her longest tenants was a man by the name of Daryl Hatfield. Daryl moved into Anita's house when he was going through a divorce, and he liked living there. He recalls that the house was immaculate, but he would tend to hang out in his room and only see Anita in passing. During his time at Anita's house, several other people rented the other spare bedroom. On at least one occasion, Daryl had to intervene between Anita and another tenant who was being disrespectful towards her in her own home. About 2 years after Daryl moved in, Anita introduced him to another new tenant, Scott Pettigrew. Anita had met 50-year-old Scott at work, and they had instantly struck up a good friendship. Daryl's first impression was that Scott was an educated, clean-cut, gay man. Daryl was happy for Scott to move into the house, as he felt that, as a friend of Anita, there would be no more issues with other tenants and their living conditions would drastically improve. However, nothing could be further from the truth. Unknown to both Anita and Daryl, Scott had a history of disturbing, abusive and violent behaviour towards other roommates and partners. Scott behaved strangely almost from the moment that he moved in. He would go into Daryl's room while he was sleeping, terrorise Daryl's cats, and even managed to convince Anita that Daryl had been secretly recording him in the bathroom, and also stealing items from the house. Scott was charming towards Anita, and she trusted him, and the relationship between her and Daryl declined very quickly. At one point, Scott left vomit and feces in the bathtub and blamed this on Daryl. Again, Anita sided with Scott. Daryl began looking for a new place to stay. In a period of just 2 weeks, he had to call the police out 5 times to gain entry into the house, as he had been locked out. In March 2016, the month after Scott moved in, Daryl went out of town for a couple of days. When he returned late on the Sunday night, he had once again been locked out of the house. He called the police, who told him to wait right there and we will be down there to get you. Daryl thought this was odd, and when the police arrived, he was handcuffed and taken to the police station. He was charged with several felonies, including senior abuse and damage of property. According to both Scott and Anita, Daryl had been acting crazy, threatening them, chasing them, and had pushed Anita over. Daryl was shocked and denied everything. He couldn't afford the bail, which was set at $150,000, and was remanded into custody. Within a month of Daryl being out of the picture, Scott and Anita's friendship was in ruins. Scott had lost his job at Walgreens and stopped paying his rent. He began openly taking Anita's food and possessions. He allowed his 2 dogs to urinate and defecate within the house. He was drinking to excess and became aggressive towards Anita. Anita's son Stephen became very uncomfortable with the situation and tried to get his mother to move in with him and Cindy. However, Anita loved her house and refused to leave it in the hands of this man who was terrorising her. She didn't know what to do. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, a home that she had worked so hard to buy and was now slowly being destroyed by a person that she had believed was her friend. Anita began hoarding her things into her bedroom and added a lock to her door. On the 31st of May, a neighbour recalled hearing Scott yelling and screaming at Anita, saying that she would rue the day she was born if anything happened to his dogs. Another neighbour heard Scott yelling and screaming as he looked for his dog, calling Anita a f***ing b***. Anita admitted to her son that she and Scott had lied about Daryl to get him out of the house. Anita had been convinced by Scott that it was Daryl that had been causing the problems around her home, and now, realising her mistake, she went to the police and told them the truth. After 100 days in jail, Daryl was released. In early June 2016, accompanied by a police officer, Daryl went to the house to retrieve his possessions. Anita helped him find his things in the garage and seemed upset over what had happened. Meanwhile, Scott told Daryl that Anita had had his cats euthanized. The cats meant the world to Daryl, but it would seem unlikely that Anita had anything to do with this, as she was such an animal lover. Stephen and Cindy believe that it was Scott who had the animals put to sleep. Not knowing what else to do, Anita turned to the courts to get Scott evicted from her home and filed the necessary paperwork. She wrote to the judge about how her things would go missing, his dogs would soil their house, and stated that she was being terrorised daily in my own home. She detailed how Scott was always yelling and screaming, adding that, "I need help, I need a restraining order, he is destroying my house." She detailed how he had angrily and falsely accused her of letting his dogs out, I do believe he created this incident to further unnerve me, saying that he was screaming like a banshee. The whole neighbourhood could hear him. Scott is initiating this to keep me in constant fear of him, and what he will do next time. I don't want a next time. She detailed how he hadn't paid her rent past his first month of living there and constantly left the home in a mess. She accused him of throwing his rubbish into the sink, vomiting in the bathroom without clearing it up, as well as pouring water onto her computer and cutting the batteries out of her home telephones. Anita requested that Scott be ordered to stay 100 yards away from her and not be allowed to contact her in any way. The request was reviewed by Riverside County Superior Court Judge James A. Cox and was partially granted and partially denied. The judge granted an order that the dog should be removed from the house immediately. Because there was no actual physical violence against Anita, he ordered Scott to stay 5 yards away from her at all times, but did not require that Scott moved out of the residence. He was allowed to remain in the house, but had to keep his distance until an additional court hearing. That was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and the intention of the hearing was to establish a permanent solution ongoing. Still extremely concerned for his mother, Stephen advised her to get a tape recorder to document any incidents where Scott got abusive and threatening, so that she could then show the court just how bad her living conditions had become. On the 14th of June 2016, Anita knew that Scott was going to be served with the order to remove his dogs from the home. She decided to stay away from the house for as long as possible that day, as she was afraid of how Scott would react to the situation. She returned home at around 6 p.m, only to find that all of her doors had been locked and she could not get inside. She called the police, who responded to her home to assist her in gaining entry. Once inside, Anita called her daughter-in-law, Cindy, and told her that Scott had been served while she was at work. He could be heard yelling, screaming and throwing things around in the background of the call. Cindy was incredibly concerned for Anita and told Stephen that she thought they needed to get to Anita's house as soon as possible. Stephen called his mother and said that they were on their way and that they would go out there and get you a hotel room, and we'll try to work on some way to get him out, pay him off, whatever it takes. During the call, Stephen could hear yelling and glass breaking in the background. He told his mother to start recording what was going on, which she did. Then, the line went dead. During the drive to Palm Springs, Stephen and Cindy repeatedly tried to call Anita, but there was no reply. They called the police and asked them to complete a welfare check. When Stephen and Cindy pulled into Anita's cul-de-sac, it was full of police cars and police officers. When they arrived at the house and asked around, they were informed that Anita was dead. The police had arrived slightly earlier to complete the welfare check, and when they knocked at the door of Anita's home, there was no answer. Officer Daniel Ames, who had been at the house just a few hours earlier to help Anita gain entry, looked through the window. Inside, he could see a vase and flower pot shattered on the floor and barking dogs running around. A second police unit was requested, and when they arrived, the officers headed to the back of the house. The gate was padlocked, so they jumped over the wall and went to the back garden. Anita's body was floating in her swimming pool. They pulled her out of the water, but it was too late to save her. The officers went inside to secure the house and found Scott lying naked in the fetal position on his bed. He had several raised red scratch marks on his body. It was established that Anita had sustained multiple injuries. She had been badly beaten around the face, head, arms and torso, and several handfuls of her hair had been torn from her head. After all that, she had then been dumped into the swimming pool. The house was strewn with broken glass and picture frames, and there were blood drag marks outside of the door which led to the back garden. Scott was handcuffed, and when asked about Anita, Scott said that Daryl was their other roommate who they were afraid of. Scott said that he was concerned that Daryl had done something to Anita. When Daryl found out what had happened, he realised that he might be considered a suspect. He turned himself in and provided a receipt from the hospital where he was being treated at the time the murder occurred. He was ruled out of having any involvement in Anita's death. Anita's digital recorder was found by the French doors in her house. The digital file stamp showed that the recording was made on the night of the murder. Anita can be heard shouting, "Stay away from me. Now you're going to start beating up an old lady. Get out of here," while Scott could be heard screaming and shouting abuse at her. During an interview with Scott, the police honed in on the events of the day of the murder, and when they got to the time of the altercation, Scott asked for his attorney. Then, after finding out about the audio recording, he said that he wanted the death penalty. Scott was charged and held at Larry D. Smith Correctional Facility in Banning in lieu of $1 million bail. On the 17th of June 2016, he pled not guilty, and when the case later went to trial, he maintained his innocence. Toxicology tests taken the morning after the murder showed that he had been drinking at the time of the attack. His lawyers would go on to argue that he was in an emotional state that night and did not premeditate the murder. However, evidence from the scene showed that he had approached Anita in the kitchen where the argument began, and he had begun throwing items around the house. There then followed a prolonged attack that spanned the length of the interior of the home and extended into the backyard areas. On the 29th of August 2019, Scott was convicted of first-degree murder, elder abuse, and violating a protective order. He was later sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He appealed his sentence on the basis that whilst he did not dispute that he killed Anita, he argued that he had done so in a fit of rage rather than it being premeditated, and as such the verdict should be one of second-degree murder. At trial, it had been shown that there were multiple stages to the attack using multiple weapons, striking Anita with a blunt object, pulling out her hair, strangling her with his hands, dragging her to the pool, leaving her there where she drowned, and thus the attack took place over a sufficiently prolonged period to allow the defendant time to reflect on his actions. His defence countered that the killing occurred in a sudden explosion of violence, which was the product of drunken rage. His conviction and sentence were upheld. Scott remains in prison and will be eligible for parole in 2033. That concludes today's story about Anita Cowen. Please subscribe if you're new to the channel and add any comments down below. Petty crime time now. Taz Gardner, who I think is from Tasmania, Australia, wants you to meet 10-month-old Daisy. She's a foster pup and a right little terror whose outlook on life and motto is no F's given. She's constantly practicing her thieving skills. If it's within reach, she'll take it. Some of the items that she's stolen include a nightgown, which was found, a favourite jumper, which wasn't found, and a hat. Yep, this hat. It's actually been shredded now. If she doesn't want to walk on her lead, she just lays down and refuses to move. Daisy looks like she's going to have a lifelong career of crime. Taz Gardner says she'll be quite a handful for her new owners if she ever gets adopted. Anyway, Taz, thanks so much for sending the pictures in of Daisy. She's a star. Thanks very much for listening to the Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. This story features in Netflix Worst Roommate Ever, Season 2, Episode 2, Housemate from Hell. Goodbye.